Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it.
It was a national vote, it was a national referendum, and Parliament has to respect that.
The working class have spoke, and I'm one of them, and I'm with them.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts.
The time where people trust politicians, that's over.
This is painful, and it will be for a long time.
Can you give us a question? I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you stay categorical?
You are fake news.
Sir.
This is a Westminster bubble thing.
What?
Hello and welcome to Politics at the Edge, the Eastminster podcast from the University of East Anglia. I'm Claire Precy, and also here with me, Professor Alan Finlayson.
Hi, Claire.
Hello. So who have we got on the panel today?
OK, so we've got a couple of my favourite colleagues of all time. I've got my colleague Suzanne Doyle.
Mm-hmm.
Suzanne, tell people what you do.
So I'm interested in UK's defence policy alongside the United States. I'm interested in the US-UK relationship, in particular the nuclear relationship, and issues of diplomacy and strategy as well.
So bombs, all things
bombs. I can tell you a lot about bombs.
Excellent.
Brilliant. I've also got my colleague Lee Marsden. Lee, what do you do?
Hi, I'm a professor of faith and global politics, and I work on things like American foreign policy, terrorism, any security-related issues, and the role of religion in the world today.
We're going to talk about global Britain and foreign policy. I mean, what do we mean by foreign policy?
Traditionally, whatever happens beyond the borders of the country. I mean, I think these are now increasingly obsolete terms, really. It's difficult to try and sort of just compartmentalise what goes on in the domestic sphere. Clearly, something like Brexit, for example, have implications both at domestic level but also international level as well. But loosely speaking, then, it is the relations that we have with other countries, how Britain exercises its role beyond its own borders.
And it feels like a really important time to be talking about this because it feels like everything's changing.
If we take a long view of history, perhaps, and we make some speculation, it feels slightly like the international system is in a fluctuation. Looking at Trump and what he's currently doing highlights that. So if we think about the international system, the international order that was set up after the Second World War, primarily by the US, but with the support of the UK and Western allies, there's now a lot of questioning of that system, questioning of the notions of free trade, questioning the kind of Bretton Woods system, questioning even the EU institution, and also the role of capitalism is also increasingly being questioned, and it all plays in together. So, yeah, it does feel like this moment of fluctuation. Where are we going next? What's going to happen?
But isn't there something specific for Britain, though, about kind of its own sense of its own role that's perhaps a bit different for some other countries? That old line about Britain lost an empire but not yet found a role seems to be kind of really kind of kicking at the moment. What is the role? What's the country supposed to be doing in the world? What are we for? And we don't seem to be sure about that in any way, whether it's being part of the big security groups with all the weapons or trying to withdraw from that, not be part of all the trade and treaties and so forth.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Britain's role has always been a little bit complex since the Second World War, since the loss of empire east of Suez. It has been desperately in search of an identity, and I think they've been able to hide behind, or we've been able to hide behind, our seat on the UN Security Council to delude ourselves that we are still a major power within the world, and to a certain extent relied upon our reputation for fair play, which was always very much exaggerated, but of decency. And so an idea that we could actually play a role, if we're not any longer sort of a major superpower, then at least we have some kind of moral authority in the world. Those old certainties are being challenged. We see the rise of populism throughout the world, and I think we are also sort of part and parcel of that sort of tendency to shift rightwards, and I think Brexit is part and parcel of this. So the rise of populism, which shouldn't come as a great surprise. I think when there are uncertainties in the world, we see. I mentioned earlier that some of my interests are how religion plays out in the world. We've seen a shift towards fundamentalism, people seeking certainties in a rapidly changing world. And I think we have, in a secular society here in Britain, we have those same sort of challenges where the old certainties are dead. What comes in its place? And people just don't know.
Yeah.
So there's this polarisation. Really.
You mentioned the Conservatives, and this has been something that they've been trying to get to grips with. So I thought it would be interesting to just play a bit of Theresa May's speech from 2017 about global Britain, and then you can kind of tell me, what you thought of that, what you made of it.
I want us to be a truly global Britain, the best friend and neighbour to our European partners, but a country that reaches beyond the borders of Europe too. A country that goes out into the world to build relationships with old friends and new allies alike. I want Britain to be what we have the potential, talent and ambition to be. A great global trading nation that is respected around the world and strong, confident and united at home.
OK, Alan, you look at speeches all the time and how what did you make of that one?
She's straining to get it out, isn't she? She's really kind of forcing the words. I feel sorry for her. Lee said Britain hides behind the chair at the Security Council. She sounds like she's literally wants to hide behind the chair. I think she's... but what she's saying, what is it? It's just a recitation of the usual kinds of nostrums about a global Britain, a great power. There's nothing really detailed there. It's an image of that the country would like to have of itself, but it doesn't seem to me it has really any sense of what that might practically mean or how one might implement that.
Is it too vague, Suzanne?
It's too vague, and I just think the UK has been trying to do this for since the end of the Second World War, with the kind of change, the shift in the power situation. And this notion that leaving the EU will facilitate that, it doesn't historically make that much sense. I mean, the United States encouraged the UK to be part of the EU because it saw value in the EU as an institution and value in kind of the UK having that relationship. The UK has also, since the end of the Second World War, been well placed in kind of diplomatically in having strong relationships around the world. So for me, it's too vague. Okay, so you're leaving the EU. How then is this going to strengthen your relationships further? How is this going to make it different to what it's been before?
In terms of changes, I think everything is up for grabs in one sense. Obviously, May is talking in terms of platitudes. Everybody voting for apple pie and custard, I'd have to say. But 40 years, we've ignored our friends. We've ignored the Commonwealth completely. We're now having to try and discover who's in the Commonwealth, what we can do in terms of trade, how we can restore that relationship, which has been so damaged over time. And it's been damaged largely by people like Theresa May, who decided that we don't want immigrants and we don't want to stop migration in this country, particularly from Commonwealth countries.
But it's politically popular, isn't it?
It's politically popular, but it sends out this distorted message to the rest of the world. How do you talk about friends and wanting to build relationships when you don't actually want their people to come to this country and either work or to stay and settle here?
So are there countries that do have a sort of distinct mission in the world? I mean, there's obviously the big countries, the US and China, but there are small countries, aren't there, like Norway and other Scandinavian countries where you think, okay, their role in the world is to be the kind of brokers of peace accords or to be the kind of, the smaller countries that, hold the ring between other larger ones or to be a touristy place or a kind of arty place. Sort of. I mean, is that am I making that up, or are there countries that do have a kind of something attached to them that defines their role in a specific way?
You can look across the water to Ireland. It kind of has that role diplomatically. It's furthered proliferation, non-proliferation efforts. It sees itself as a kind of peace broker in many ways. It trades on its kind of soft power, the fact that the Irish tend to have a sort of cultural representation that helps. So there are these countries that do these roles, and the kind of being a middle power in the world is very influential and important. You don't have to be a great power. But what I would also say here is, on this issue of the Commonwealth, is does the Commonwealth countries want to have that stronger relationship with us? They are former colonial countries. They are trying to move on, arguably, from that past. You cannot take the view that, oh, well, we're Britain, we're part of the empire. Of course they want to have this strong relationship with us.
Yeah.
No, a lot of them, particularly India, for example, they are a rising power on their own.
Okay, well, let's hear from one of our guest speakers at UEA. We're pretty lucky. We get a lot of interesting people come and talk to us. And one of them who came to talk to us this year was Ben Donaldson. He's the head of campaigns at the United Nations Association UK. And he was very, very critical of British foreign policy. So let's have a listen to what he had to say.
For me, the role of a global Britain is about consistency. It's about having a coherent, joined-up UK foreign policy. Right now, the UK is shooting itself in the foot on one issue, whilst sort of holding out a helping hand on another, and it's really inconsistent. It's problematic for the UK's sort of credibility and influence. What's happening in Yemen is a fantastic example, with the UK both giving its development money to try and rebuild bits of Yemen, which is in a terrible, in the throes of a terrible humanitarian catastrophe, but at the same time giving exporting arms to Saudi Arabia, which is a country which is intervening in Yemen, and all the impartial analysis is that suggests that Saudi Arabia is contravening the Arms Trade Treaty and causing many civilian casualties and problems for people in Yemen. So it's totally inconsistent. So is he right? Do you think he's got a point about the UK shooting itself in the foot?
Well, yes. I mean, shooting ourselves in the foot. The problem with British foreign policy is no different now to it's always been. It's the charge of hypocrisy. And we will put trading relationships above any other relationship. And so Saudi Arabia gets a pass on most things. This is one of the most authoritarian, human rights abusing regimes who actually go out of their way to try and encourage a extreme form of Islam. And yet, because they are significant buyers of our weapons and other goods, we give them a pass when it comes to holding them to account. The issue over Yemen, which of course was a former British territory, is particularly problematic. We have here some of the worst violence going on in the world at the moment. We have a completely partial view from the government about the wrongs and rights of that situation. Meantime, hundreds, thousands of Houthi are either starving, dying of disease, or being killed by armaments, which we help supply and support.
But presumably, Alan, it's politically very difficult for Theresa May to do anything about Yemen at the moment. She's got so many other things on her plate, hasn't she?
Well, certainly the UK government can't be thinking in very long, detailed, strategic terms about its foreign policy goals while it's so self-consumed with Brexit and while it's so unclear what it's going to do economically in the future. I think it's interesting what Lee says about focusing on trading relationships first and foremost, which in lots of respects makes sense, but actually part of good trade relationships might be doing other things apart from trade, building up friendly relationships, developing institutions, being seen as a fair dealer. But no, they're not going to be thinking about that when they're just thinking about tomorrow's headline.
Mm. If we're selling arms to these other countries, it puts us in a really difficult position, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I'm going to sound cynical here, but these things always happen. Arms trades happen because, as Lee says, they make money. The British economy is, in part, very reliant upon the arms industry for jobs and for the economic value it brings. And I would also say, foreign policy is always inconsistent. It's why I find it so interesting to research and study, because you're trying to look at policymakers and think, what kind of vision have they got here? Because they just often deal with things separately, and it doesn't make sense in a coherent fashion.
Do you see that? Is that a long-term pattern? That's not just now.
It's a long-term pattern across history, because you can have notions of grand strategy and vision, but actually when you're acting on a day-to-day basis, you react in part to the context of which you're in, the situations that arise, and that's very difficult then to create a coherent, sensible strategy.
OK, so one of the other issues we brought up already is Brexit. And of course, Boris Johnson's been talking about how he hopes that Britain's going to still play a very important role in the world post-Brexit. So let's have a listen to him, and then you can react to that.
It makes sense for us to continue to be intimately involved in European foreign and security policy. It would be illogical not to discuss such matters as sanctions together, bearing in mind that the UK expertise provides more than half of all EU sanctions listings. We will continue to be Europeans both practically and psychologically, because our status as one of the great contributors to European culture and civilization, and our status as one of the great guarantors of the security of Europe, is simply not dependent on the Treaty of Rome as amended at Maastricht or Amsterdam or Lisbon.
Good old Boris, eh? He gives a good speech, doesn't he? But yes, what's behind it? Is he right, I suppose, is the obvious question.
Yes, he is. Really? In the sense, it's a
Boris,
surprise
right?
on that particular clip, though probably
generally
not generally. He's right that Britain will continue to have a significant role. The peace of Europe is not dependent necessarily on the European Union, but it is specifically dependent upon NATO. And our membership of NATO continues, and indeed most members of the EU are also members of NATO, and so that relationship is important. Security arrangements, Britain providing significant security information and sharing of information with European countries is a vital part of that. So I don't see any sort of change really in that relationship. We are still dependent upon the French to land our planes on their aircraft carriers at the moment. So that relationship, again, part of being in the UN Security Council together, part of being in NATO together, those relationships will continue.
How much does Brexit matter in terms of our security? Is it possible to say, or is it just one of those unknowns?
I think it's an unknown. It depends on the deal that's reached. I think Lee raises an important point, though, that we've reached a point in the kind of international system where there are these very firm institutional ties between people and between organisations that have created what perhaps we could see as a security community. So the ties between the UK and other NATO countries, it runs kind of deep down into the kind of technical, policy, military levels. And this creates kind of a robust, say, ties between them, which Brexit isn't going to break. In other ways, it depends upon what might happen in terms of intelligence sharing. We're still not sure there what will happen. The UK has a very key role in that in the world, partly because it's kind of very strong relationship with the US on this area. I mean, I love that clip because he says at one point, we will not move psychologically or what. I was thinking, you can't move the island, can you? I mean, I know some of them might want to.
So am I wrong as a non-expert to kind of worry that actually he is wrong in the sense that we will move psychologically and are moving psychologically away from Europe, that it's subtle things, it's people thinking, I do see this in young people, sometimes students, that maybe Europe doesn't matter so much in British life, maybe we don't need to know that much about it or learn languages and so forth, and we'll begin to withdraw from involvement in the institutions of European life more broadly. Clearly not being in the EU means we won't be in various meetings and committee meetings, and people won't be employed in some of the institutions that you're talking about, and we will slowly drift. Is that, am I making that up?
There's a drift, and I guess it also depends how you define security. If you're looking at security broadly defined, if you look at economic security, if you look at intelligence, you look at the internet, our personal data, those sorts of issues are more likely to be at risk. In terms of the security of Britain, I don't fear for the physical security of Britain as such. The biggest danger to Britain's security is the same danger that there is today, that a decision was taken a number of decades ago now to outsource our foreign policy to the United States. And we are the add-on to American foreign policy. So we have very few initiatives of our own. It is Me Too in terms of following American foreign policy. That has had effects in terms of blowback, in terms of how we're seeing. And that is unlikely to change. There are security implications and threats, though, for the rest of Europe, which I think, by Britain's withdrawal from the EU and uncertainty across with far-right parties emerging as well, there's a lot of flux and insecurity within the EU itself, which could become sort of prime pickings for emboldened Russian Federation.
Okay, well,
and so those dangers in Eastern Europe, I think, are made worse by Britain's withdrawal.
We got from Brexit to Russia in 4 steps. Yay.
Well, let's hear again from Ben Donaldson, Head of Campaigns at United Nations Association UK, and he's worried about conflict as well and where we could end up.
I think the worst sort of enemy for the UK is apathy, and the UK's interests are so sort of dependent. We talk about sort of like the pandemics that the UK could be exposed to, climate change. We talk about the security issues with regards to terrorism and with regards to military operations, and for example, that are in the east of Europe. The period of 73 years of relative global peace, and certainly in Europe, the peace that we've enjoyed for so long. The idea that is inevitable needs to be challenged. It's not inevitable. If the international system falls apart because we're not thinking about the international system enough, then actually we could find ourselves returning to a situation of conflict, even in Western Europe.
So he's worried about conflict. Suzanne Doyle, are you?
I'm always worried about conflict.
Isn't conflict good for business from that point of view? But more to write about.
I don't want to die from a nuke, thanks. Again, if we take a long view of history, conflict reoccurs. This notion that the peace that we've seen in Europe is unique partly is, but it's partly an ahistorical view. It doesn't take into account the period of peace that existed between the Congress in Vienna and the First World War. I think for me, my real concern, though, currently is that if we take a broad view of security, the real issues I think we're going to face are climate change, etc., perhaps pandemics. What is needed to deal with these issues is a kind of broad-based international approach. What we're currently arguably seeing in the international system is a return towards isolationism, a return to moving away from these institutions. We're seeing it in the US, we're seeing it in the UK, we're seeing it in other places. We're seeing a rise in right-wing politics, which I find really concerning as well. The system has to change. There's clearly something going on at the moment which is leading to a lot of inequality, a lot of disenfranchisement with the kind of international system, the way it's working. It's how it changes, I think, is crucial. And my concern is it's going towards this right-wing isolationist.
Is part of that sort of what you hinted at earlier, that countries that haven't been central to the international system in the past, like India, are now big powers economically, politically, militarily. They're kind of pushing at getting in. Things that other countries are coming up behind them as well. I mean, it's part of the tension that the old and powerful countries want to defend their interests against them, or is it more chaotic than that?
I think it's more chaotic. That is part of it, though, that there's kind of rising powers, China, India, many others, who want to be part of this system, want to shape it to suit kind of their vision. And it's, okay, well, how does that happen? How is it accommodated? How does it change? I think the format of the Security Council needs to change. It has its uses. It brought buy-in from the great powers at the end of the Second World War. They had to be given a veto power to ensure that they kind of supported the institution. But now something clearly needs to change. It needs to change on the international level in terms of letting other countries be part of the international system, international order that the UK and US were very much part of formulating. But I think it also really needs to happen at a domestic level. That kind of, as I said, there's a lot of inequality, problems of globalisation. How do we deal with these issues?
What needs to change, Lee Marsden?
A lot needs to change in terms of the whole system. I mean, I'm just thinking really in terms of what won't change, and I don't think the UN Security Council is going to change. I don't think Turkey's vote for Christmas. But I think what does need to happen is there does need to be, right across all institutions, a greater listening to ordinary people and to be cognizant of the struggles that people have, particularly since the 2008 financial crash, where people have just been marginalised. And that pain is still there.
Can we bring it back to where we started then, which was this question about Britain's sort of identity, its existential sense of itself in the world? Because it seems to me that the kind of pro-Brexit argument that Brexit creates an opportunity for the country to go on a new path, that's presumably true in the most general sense. There is actually an opportunity for the country to think about what role it wants to do, and that's an opportunity not just for the governmental level of foreign policy and institution building, but also culturally for British, English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish people to think, okay, who are we? What is our role in the world? And I wonder if there's something for people to do to think about that, what contribution they want to make to the world as UK citizens, as well as thinking about, in the future, after the Brexit struggles are calmed down in some respects, can we begin to think about a changed role for the Britain? What should that be? What could that be? If we were thinking more positively, are there things that the country has to offer the world, or should we just retire and say let others get on with it? We did our bit. The sun now sets.
I mean, I think you're right in terms of this does present an opportunity. The difficulty, of course, is because there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen that those voices get filled by people on the far right and sort of have an agenda of sort of perhaps restored empire, or sort of certainly trying to have a very strong role for Britain within the world. But I think, if we actually think about what Britain claims to be on the side of the underdog, for fairness, for justice, we've never, ever fulfilled that sort of remit. But here's an opportunity to actually do so, to actually think about how we can contribute to society, as indeed the Scandinavian countries did in terms of trying to negotiate peace settlements and things like that, to actually have that role about making a fairer, more decent world. But we have to believe that, and we can't hide behind the hypocrisy that we've pursued for generations.
So what about at the grassroots level, as it were? Because there's obviously, it seems to me that part of what's happening at the moment is a generational split, and there are younger people who want to play some part in the world, and they are quite outward looking in terms of the places they know about in the world and where they want to go. Do you think there's a possibility that we might see a different sort of relationship between Britain and the world, led by just individuals going out and wanting to do things and work in different places and be part of broader change? Or am I hopelessly utopian?
I'm hopeful of that as well. And I don't know that it's generational. I think it's also the fact that we do live in a very interconnected world, which the world has completely changed in my lifetime. I mean, I'm classed as millennial, but I remember you had dial-up connection, and that was really high-tech and stuff. And now we can talk to anyone from around the world. We can build communities around the world. People can travel. But this creates opportunities that and will change the world in ways I think we haven't seen yet. It is a recent development, say 20 years or so, these changes have really occurred. If we think of the revolutions that have happened in the past, printing press, the telephone, the internet, it has completely changed the international system.
Okay, so it could be a positive. Let's hope for a positive future.
I should probably say something cheesy like, with such inspiring teachers, young people will click. Yeah, okay. I won't say that.
All right, thank you all very much. It's been a really, really interesting chatting to you. If you want to hear more or to read more, you can go to the Eastminster website, ueapolitics.org. Our podcast, Politics at the Edge, is produced. It's a production of the Politics Department from the University of East Anglia, hosted by me, Claire Precy, and Professor Alan Finlayson. If you want to hear more episodes, you can subscribe to us. Quick thanks to the BBC, Sky and ITV for our news clips and our intro. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.